Welcome to AMS on the Air. I am Irene Sands.
I'm Dakota Smith.
And I'm Jeff Rosenfeld, and we're here to podcast about all things weather, water, and climate.
Also, women may choose to exit the industry earlier in their careers. So that leaves, mainly a pool of older, more experienced, mainly males, to fill those chief spots. Put it in my study, there's a little bit that deals with the Screen Actors Guild study that refuted the notion that women's voices lack authority. And they did a study in 1986 that showed that a woman's voice sold products as well as a man's.
This week, we're featuring an episode with Alexandra Cranford on her article that was in BAMS about a year ago titled Women Weathercasters, Their Positions, Education, and Presence in Local TV.
Our interview with Alexandra Cranford this episode is about women in weathercasting, in particular on local broadcasting. And I'm wondering, Irene, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into weathercasting and broadcast in general.
It's funny, Jeff, because I got into broadcast for the science. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a meteorologist. And I think because I'm a woman, I fell into the broadcast side of it. I started in Spanish, so from the get-go, there's not that many Spanish-speaking meteorologists, much less Spanish-speaking women meteorologists. So I saw an opportunity there, and I think that's the reason why I got into broadcast. And then as soon as I tasted the broadcast sweetness, I liked it more, and informing the viewers and the public was my second passion, let's say, which has become my first passion now. But I love science, and that's how I got into meteorology. But within meteorology and within the broadcast side, being a woman on TV or in this era, in any digital field, it's hard. There's not that many of us.
How does that affect your experience being one of a few rather than someone who might be able to convince themselves that they're in a majority position?
It does affect it. And as far as in the most struggle that I've had with being a woman meteorologist has been with management, let's say. Viewers tend to realize rather quickly if you're prepared or not to be on air or to inform them when there's a weather threat. Management often is not, because they have this stereotype that they follow, and it's hard to get their thoughts changed or their views changed. So that has been my biggest struggle through the last decade in broadcast.
One of the things that caught our attention with Alexandra's article is that, first of all, it's not that common for broadcast meteorologists to get around to doing any kind of research like this. And so I was impressed right from the start, just by that fact alone. But also she came up with some really interesting findings about how women are making up some ground in terms of their representation in local TV stations as meteorologists, but they're not making up that ground in terms of their leadership roles on the stations. They're still lagging way behind as a percentage of the station chiefs. So the question really comes down to, why is that? But she gathered some really interesting data to hopefully help improve the situation over the long haul. So let's hear the interview. We should start a little bit by thinking about, and you maybe could tell us a little bit about how you got curious about the role of women in the various jobs on the weathercasting market, and what led you to do the article.
Let's see, what started me sort of being interested in this is that I am a weathercaster on TV right now. I work in New Orleans at a local TV station. And I just think it's fascinating to see the people who are actually giving the weather to people. If you ask most people to name a meteorologist, they'll probably, perhaps name their local meteorologist they see on TV. So I think that's really interesting. And I actually read a BAMS article a couple of years ago. It was 2014, and it was a by Perryman and Thies. And they looked at the kind of the weather girl stereotype. And I remember reading that article and I was like, wow, this is so interesting, because I think it captured things that we see on TV, and kind of gave it a sort of, a meatiness, and sort of almost quantified it a little bit. So that's kind of what I was trying to capture with this article. Also, I've just always really, really wondered, we see these men and women in these weathercaster roles. And my big question, the really, really big one that sort of drove this whole thing, was I wanted to know if they did both have about the same amount of meteorology degrees. So are the women we see on the air giving us the weather forecast, are they, about as qualified as the men, and are the men as qualified as the women? So that was really the main thing that I sort of sparked this whole thing.
So what did you find, first of all, in terms of the education background? Maybe you can explain that to people who haven't read the article. And I have read it a couple of different times for different purposes, but I can't remember the numbers on the educational backgrounds that you found.
Yeah, sure. I actually found, looking at all 210 markets across the U.S., from the data that was given in these Weathercaster website biography pages, I found 52% of females had a meteorology degree, compared with 59% of males. And so it turned out to be statistically significant. But, if you just look at those numbers, that's not necessarily huge enough, perhaps, to actually cause someone to look at males and females differently, in those weathercaster roles. So, bottom line, I found 52% of females and 59% of males had meteorology degrees.
And one of the fascinating things about that, if I remember, was that not only did men, was a higher percentage of male weathercasters had meteorology degrees, but the percentage goes up for both men and particularly for women in the smaller markets.
Isn't that interesting?
It's just bizarre. So I guess now I'm looking at the chart again, and it was just over 60% of men in the sort of the middle, in the lower 110 markets, right? So you divided up 210 TV markets. The top 100, it was 54% of the men had a degree in meteorology, but in the smaller markets and the other half, over 60% of the men. And for women, it was 47% about for the larger markets, and over 55% in the smaller markets. So there's a big jump there from, that's like over 10%. So, or it depends on how you look at the number, but from 47 to 57, that's a big jump. What do you think's the reason behind that?
I thought that was so interesting too. And I didn't expect to find that at all, by the way. I was just that was just one of the things I was looking at among many. And then I was like, whoa, this is strange. But I think, I go into it during the discussion part of my article a little bit, that perhaps larger markets maybe favor weathercasters who have these positive attributes other than a meteorology degree. So maybe they have a great personality, maybe they're attractive, maybe they have good chemistry with other newscasters. And then there's also the notion of parasocial interaction, which is the notion that viewers can develop their relationships with weathercasters or any on-air personality almost as if they were face-to-face, or almost as if, they know them personally. So my guess would be that, there's something about these weathercasters, who are drawn into or drawn toward the larger markets, who have these other qualities besides, the actual meteorology degree that puts them up there.
There was this earlier study in 2008 that showed, the number was more like 56% for both men and women having meteorology degrees, right? And but there's some question. Maybe, I mean, your method's a little different. So it sounds like yours is a broader study in a way. You were able to get a little bit more response than what that was. Chris Wilson, I think maybe it was 2008. So how did you get a good response like you did? And then what do you think? How do you think the way you did the study might have affected some of those numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I picked this way that kind of just made sense to me in a really obvious way, but it had some good points and some bad points. What I did was I actually looked at every single weathercaster biography webpage. So I went to every station across the U.S. in all these 210 local, news markets. And I went to their, station webpage and I clicked on each weathercaster. And so that's how I gathered my data. So I didn't actually send out a survey. So the method of data collection was different. And as far as I know, this is the biggest biographical or geographical study that's been done on weathercasters, to my knowledge. So I had 2,040 people who I looked at, weathercasters across the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a little bit tedious, you can imagine.
Yes.
Going to each one. But especially when I came upon the pages where there was just a list of like 50 people who worked for the station, and you couldn't tell who was a weathercaster and who was just an anchor or reporter. And I had to click on every single person to figure out who was the weathercaster. But anyway, got through it. So that was good. And out of that, it had some good points and some bad points. The good thing was that I just got this huge wealth of information. It's publicly available. And I was, able to sort of see it without any sort of, I guess you could say, any bias that might come from surveys and things like that. But of course, there were a lot of cases of missing data where you would click on a bio and it would just be blank, or, it didn't include the information I was looking for. It just had a line or two like, hi, I'm whoever from wherever, and didn't say what their educational background was or what their position at the station is. So that was something, of course, that, I had to take into consideration. So the good thing was, I had this huge wealth of information that's all out there on the internet already. And the bad thing was that there was plenty of missing data for, both the weathercaster position, morning, evening, and so forth, and also for the educational backgrounds.
But it's an exhausting amount of work, right? I mean, that's must have taken a few years. How long did it take to do all that?
It only took a few months. It took from February to October, I believe, back in 2016. So this is what I came up with. I know, over 2,000.
That's fresh data too, which is nice. I have to wonder what you found out about your colleagues while you were. I know this is getting off track here, so we'll get back on track. But I'm just curious, what do you think you learned about other TV, stations and how they market people and how they play up different characteristics of their on-air personalities when you were doing this research?
Let's see. I definitely figured out that all the chief meteorologists are definitely going to put it there. It's going to be there in the bio. It's going to be pretty clear. I think in most cases, you could figure out who was like the lead forecaster or weathercaster. I suspected that perhaps some of the lower status people maybe wouldn't have included certain information in their bios, and so therefore might have been slightly underrepresented. For example, if you just work part-times or weekends, maybe you don't put that in your bio, as opposed to if you're a chief and you want everyone to know I'm the boss, So I thought that was kind of interesting. I wonder, one thing I did wonder when I was going through this, and I would love to, figure it out, is who is writing these bios? I think I've worked at a few different stations, and I always write my own bios. So I thought it was interesting that if that's the case, it always has been for me. If that's the case for everybody else, I thought it was very interesting to see how these weathercasters, presented themselves, assuming many of them were written by the weathercaster, themselves.
Yeah. Did you get an overwhelming sense of seriousness or friendliness, or just in these portrayals and bios, or it's kind of curious.
Yeah, a lot of them were very similar, actually, which is kind of funny. Maybe they, their boss told them to just sit down and write something, and they had to put something down. One thing that I found is that a huge number of meteorologists have known that they wanted to be a TV meteorologist since they were a kid. That was a very common story from a lot of these different on-air meteorologists. They would say, oh, ever since Jeff was 5, he knew the thunderstorms were interesting and knew he wanted to be the weather guy. So I thought, definitely that stuck out to me. A lot of these people seem to almost have a calling for it and to be fascinated by the weather since they were little.
You kind of hope that it would make a difference, but what do you think would make a difference, if at all? I mean, just sort of sitting at looking at those numbers is very stark.
Yeah, it is, and I don't know. There are different things that you can think about. Perhaps there is some sexism in hiring practices. Perhaps, when a hiring manager is interviewing a man versus a woman weathercaster, they're looking at slightly different criteria. So, of course, that's a possibility. Another thing is maybe women are choosing for some reason, perhaps to work, maybe weekends and mornings, and maybe women are kind of staying away from some of those key positions for some reason. I have no idea if this is the case. I'm just throwing out ideas here, but possibly due to family reasons or just personal preference, that could maybe be another thing. Also, women may choose to exit the industry earlier in their careers. So that leaves, mainly a pool of older, more experienced, mainly males, to fill those chief spots, which are typically, filled by an older, more experienced person. And then one of the reviewers of my study brought my attention to the effect that all of us, think about, but, how much of a real effect might it have? The effect of criticism from consultants and social media and so forth. We all know about the internet trolls. Anyone who works as a TV weathercaster, I'm sure has gotten emails from, viewers and comments on social media posts and things like that. So, that's a very real thing too. And, there is research that says maybe that's a bit worse for females versus males. So, maybe that can play a role as well. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there because you actually quoted some some interesting. You brought in some interesting quotes in the article, like this one from Janice Huff about a lot of people think something coming from a man's mouth is more authoritative, and I think that resonated a lot with me because I think about those. Those bomber pilots or whatever in the Air Force or something like that. They found that if they had a female voice giving them an alert to like pull a switch or do while they were flying, that it worked better than using a male voice as a prompter kind of thing in the cockpit. And you can kind of imagine maybe that there are certain situations where people respond better to a female voice and others to a male voice, and it's all just cultural whatever. Just what they're used to or whatever it is, but it's not inconceivable, at least, that the people doing the hiring think that this is the voice that's going to work for this situation, that they just match it, and then it's too late. You can't really shake that out of somebody's head by that point, not easily.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think that there has been some research that for example, the people, when you come off a subway or something, often that's a female voice. There is something about the female voice that, could maybe be just as authoritative or just as persuasive or whatever you want to say as a man's. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it could go, both ways, but you're right. It's the person who's doing the hiring that, I guess, has the final say.
Well, I wonder too, if maybe someday we could extend this to radio, which might be harder because radio, websites and, it's kind of hard to get the data, but that maybe it would have a bigger effect in radio if that were the case. Although, there's a lot of crossover from TV to radio. If that's what radio stations are looking for, then that would say maybe the voice has something to do with it, because certainly on TV, it's more than a voice. There's a lot going on. The gestures, your smile, everything, you can communicate so many different things than just with your voice.
Yes. And while you're saying that, I put it in my study, there's a little bit that deals with the Screen Actors Guild study that refuted the notion that women's voices lack authority. And they did a study in 1986 that showed that a woman's voice sold products as well as a man's in voiceover commercials. But think about it, when you hear a voiceover for like a movie or something, it's always that raspy male voice, isn't it? So
yeah. Yeah, there are only like two actors I can think of who are in every movie. It's either Morgan Freeman or, for a long time, it's Peter Coyote, or, there are all these certain actors you just hear all the time.
Yeah, so a part of it might just be tradition. We're used to hearing that big, deep, rumbling voice to sell us those action movies and other movies, and that's just what they go with. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, so one thing that I wonder also about is the whole notion that daytime television may traditionally have been seen as a woman's domain because a lot of housewives supposedly were watching, or there's some kind of prejudice about women being the right place or in the right place when they're on daytime television. Is that a possibility?
Sure, I think so. I don't know exactly what you mean, but yeah, that sounds plausible. I'd be interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, I don't know. It occurs to me that daytime TV is kind of this special domain. Of course, nowadays with the aging of our population, you'd think that would no longer be so much true. It just seems like there are a lot of older people watching during the day as opposed to women versus men. But yeah, but when you were starting out, I'm not sure exactly. Maybe you can explain a little bit about how you got into uh, weathercasting, because I understand that you got a chance to do some in college, even. So you've been doing this from a fairly early age, and I'm just wondering who your inspirations were when you started out.
Oh, for me, I was telling you that most of the weathercaster bios, claimed, like you were saying, maybe it's just a claim, but they kind of started out with, this person is known forever that they wanted to be a meteorologist. But for me, it really wasn't that. It was more just, I kind of just had to think through, a little more sort of logically and less magically, but just kind of think through what kind of my career path should be and what I wanted to do. And so for me, it came down to especially what people do with their time during their workday. I'd had a couple of internships where, it was very interesting material and seemed very right up my alley with science and oceanography, but the actual, day-to-day, hour-to-hour activities, I found a little bit monotonous. So it was very important to me to have a job that was kind of interesting and had different elements to it throughout the day. And so that I thought was a great thing about, being a TV weathercaster, is that you're doing part of your job is to do things on air. You're doing things behind the scenes. You're writing articles for the web. You're actually making the forecast. So it's a kind of a varied and interesting sort of work day. So that appealed to me. And also it's a kind of weird job, isn't it? It's this weird little cross section between English and like presenting. And then you have science and math in there too. So it's just kind of this strange cross section of things that I thought sounded cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suspect you were a better student than I was, because you obviously mastered a lot of different things to get there. Did you so you had a chance at LSU, was it, to do some, what was that like doing your first weathercasts in that environment?
Oh, I was terrible for sure. I, was just pointing at the graphics and sort of just talking nervously, but it was cool. It was fun to do it and to think about the weather and think about making a forecast and so forth. So that's where I started doing it. And LSU, of course, as many people listening will probably know, doesn't have a meteorology program. So I had to graduate from LSU in a different field, in political communication, and then afterwards got a master's degree in meteorology. So that's kind of how I came into the field, a little roundabout way.
What was it like catching up on the math and science after you decided, okay, I'm going to plunge into this? Had you already been keeping up with that as an undergrad, or was that more of a late thing that came later?
I had taken, thankfully, I had taken enough different things. I had already taken some, chemistries and physics and so forth. So I'd already kind of begun the process. But yeah, after that, I continued as I had a full-time job, right after college, as a, an on-air weathercaster, but I just didn't have the meteorology degree to go with it. So I was taking these courses, maybe just, 1 and 2 per semester at a time. And eventually, thank goodness, all of that eventually, culminates into an actual degree. So that was a relief, but it did take a while. So, I know that there are people right now who are doing a full-time job and doing the school too. And it seems like it'll never end. And then eventually, it does. You just have to chip away at it, I think.
Well, it takes a lot of perseverance to do anything after you graduate, and while you're working, that's always impressive. Well, thank you very much, Alexandra, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. It's quite an honor. I appreciate it.
So that's it for this week's episode of AMS on the Air.
Tune in for our next episode, where we'll showcase an interview from Phoenix, where we had our recent 2019 AMS annual meeting.
And don't forget to follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe to the feed that you're listening to right now to get future episodes.
For Lakota, Jeff, and myself, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you the next time on the air.
Happy weather!